Hey, I'm Dan and this is my 250cc powered 5-speed motorised Esky. So the idea for this thing started pretty simple. I had an Esky, I had a 250cc motorbike that wasn't much good, Chinese bike. Great motor though. It's basically a knockoff of a Honda. It's a Zongshen. Yeah, 5-speed, 250, runs well, so I thought, hell, why not build a motorised Esky? I built this when I was 15 years old and it's still going today. The combination with the tyres and wheels steering setup off this thing, most of it came off a ride-on lawnmower. I went to a local shop where I knew the guys and asked them if they had anything laying around. Happened to have these wheels and tyres, so that's what I ran with. So the design for the frame of this thing was drawn out very technically on the shed floor with a pencil. Basically laid out the motor, the wheels, the Esky, what I wanted to fit between the rails, and went from there. I designed the rear axle myself. It's just a bit of inch bar with custom made bearing mounts and sprocket and disc brake mount. I took the disc brake and caliper off the motorbike and made them suit. Steering in the front end here, that's all off the ride-on mower that the wheels came off. So the frame of this thing I built with help from a mate of mine, Steve. I didn't have a welder at the time and he was a much better welder than I was, and like I said, I was 15. A lot of help from him in his shed. We cut up a heap of steel tube and worked out what we needed to do, mounted the motor, mounted the Esky, made up the axle and went from there. So the motor is basically the same as when I took it out of the motorbike, other than a couple of small things. I added this tube because it did have an airbox on it in the motorbike, so I just put a plenum and a pod filter on it. The exhaust is again off the motorbike, just cut back shorter with a smaller muffler. Sounds pretty rowdy. And adapted the sprocket just to space it out a little bit so that the chain would clear the side of the block to come down to meet the axle. So you may have noticed the suicide shifter in the video. This thing is basically a bearing mount that I machined out, bolted to the chassis, a handle that I've made, that's the clutch on the handle. And it runs back to what was the original kick shifter on the motorbike here, which I've added it's got two different settings for shifter throw. So as you can see, that's your shift right there. So it does make it a little bit sketchy because you've got to take your hands off the handlebars to change gears, but hey, it works. So after I went through the basic design of the thing, I actually got it running the day before Australia Day, a fair few years ago now, and it was basic then. It was just primer, didn't have the running boards or the dash, didn't have any of the electronics. That was all added afterwards. So I went along and added a bigger battery isolator, fire extinguisher because safety is important. Got a voltmeter, gear shift indicator, tacho, ignition switches and that, brake light, LED running lights and headlight. So this thing's called the GT Esky because it's an Esky, and when you put a 250 behind one, well, GT Esky. So the main sort of learning curves in making this thing were setting up the disc brake and sprocket and the steering. As you can see, there's no suspension, which makes it pretty basic and easy and cheap to build, but does have some effect on the handling. The thing slides really well on flat sort of gravel and dirt, but anything sort of rocky or it tends to lift wheels and try and throw you off the side, so you got to watch it. So fabrication on the rear axle in this started with a bit of 1-inch steel bar. I took that and then had to mount the motorbike sprocket and disc brake to it. I did that by machining a couple of carriers for those that centralised the sprocket and disc brake, and then welded plates to the side of those to actually mount the bolts. And then two bearings under the chassis here, which mount to the outside of those with grub screws and pins to stop them moving. And then the wheels are held on by two grub screws and a pin either side. So the main comparison in taking this out of the bike frame and doing this with it is obviously you're adding extra weight, especially when the Esky's full, depending on how big your weekend is. The tyres are slightly smaller than the motorbike, which is good because it lowered the gearing, so I could just use the standard sprocket and chain setup, didn't have to get anything else. Yeah, other than that, it's pretty good. So that's enough talking about it, let's see what it does. sort of content you love seeing, feel free to subscribe, like the video, get around us on the socials. We've got lots of other stupid ideas to share.